Let's start with an apparently external sociological distinction that gets made between analytic and continental philosophy. I realize that means more to people in professional philosophy than to those who are not, and I realize it also means more in the Anglophone world, but most people have some idea of what this is. Zizek put this humorously. If you work on a rat's vertebra, that's philosophy. If you work on Hegel, that's comp lit. That's the way it's viewed in the American universities these days. It's very popular now to say that this distinction is meaningless, that it's exaggerated, that it's merely sociological. I hold, on the contrary, that it contains a very essential difference between two approaches to philosophy in it. And I think this distinction was theorized by Franz Brentano in 1894. Brentano, of course, was the great Austrian philosopher, the teacher of Edmund Husserl and Sigmund Freud. And he also had a wonderfully acerbic way of delivering lectures. And in a lecture he gave in Vienna in 1894, he said that philosophy has a twofold nature. On the one hand, philosophy is like the natural sciences. It makes cumulative progress, it uncovers truth gradually. That's one side of philosophy. On the other side, you have the fact that philosophy is more like the arts, the fine arts. It has rising periods of ripeness and falling periods of decay. There are great periods in philosophy. It's not necessarily cumulative, just as the arts are not necessarily cumulative. And this has not really been picked up, but I think this is essentially the difference between analytic and continental philosophy. The analytic philosophers see themselves as natural scientists. They see themselves as making cumulative progress in detail on small frontline research programs and short journal articles. To the culture of the sciences very much. Whereas continental philosophy is a tradition of great figures, great periods in philosophy like German idealism or phenomenology that seem to rise above the rest, and philosophy is not treated as cumulative. So I think there's a lot more to be said about that, and people talk as though the difference between these two kinds of philosophy is scandalous. Two kinds of philosophy, even though there are 24,500 species of fish, somehow having two kinds of philosophy is supposed to be this horrible intellectual scandal that we need to eliminate immediately. Even Badiou, one of our own, claims to be beyond this distinction because he works on set theory, he also works on poetry. But I don't think that's quite it. I think that you need to look at a deeper sense in which philosophy is polarized between these two ways of looking at truth. One, that truth is a gradual cumulative process of piling up minute discovery on minute discovery. The other sense in which truth comes in bursts. And ironically, Badiou is not really beyond that distinction. Badiou is an archetypal continental philosopher in this sense, right? Because his theory of the event, it's not something that gradually gets better and better and better. The subject is formed only intermittently at certain times in history. So Badiou is actually the textbook example of a continental philosopher, and that's fine. I'm in that camp myself. But I think this deadlock was not resolved by Brentano, and it will continue forever until someone comes up with a new kind of philosophy that incorporates both of those somehow. But that's not my theme tonight. That's only an appetizer. My theme is that in the continental tradition, to which I and probably almost all of you belong insofar as you do philosophy, realism has never been a serious option. Among analytic philosophers, you can always find people who say the real world exists outside the mind. We can know it using certain methodological procedures. In continental philosophy, it's been viewed with scorn as a kind of pseudo-problem or a waste of time. In this sense, it's ditched realism altogether. I've been telling this anecdote in my seminars today about the Richard Rorty archive, which does exist at UC Irvine. A friend of mine was in there and saw a letter from Rorty to somebody that said, every 10 years or so, somebody writes a book with a title something like Beyond Realism and Idealism. And it turns out always that what's beyond realism and idealism is idealism. So in other words, you say it's a false problem because we ourselves are the ones who posit the very difference, and so the difference between realism and idealism is already contained in our very addressing of the question. That's an idealist position. A realist position is much more straightforward. It doesn't just mean that the world exists outside of our minds, but that's the first essential step. There are some things that realism also doesn't contain, and some other features that are very important that I'll get to tonight. I'd say it wasn't until about the last 10 or 12 years that you started seeing explicitly realist positions in continental philosophy with a straight face, without smirks or winks or crossed fingers. Bruno Latour, for example, one of my favorite philosophers alive today, uses the term realism in Pandora's Hope in 1999, but he doesn't really mean it. He's trying to redefine the term so that it doesn't mean what it used to mean. Derridians now, a lot of Derridians are saying Derrida is actually a realist, but all they're trying to do is redefine the term realism so that it's not this threatening outside, so that it's always already incorporated into what Derrida was doing, which is an explicitly anti-realist project. Manuel de Landa, along with the speculative realists, even before, Manuel de Landa was an EGS faculty member, was the one who was saying that Deleuze is a realist. Deleuze believes there's an external reality outside the mind, and that's why he's not a postmodernist. And that reading of Deleuze has certainly been contested. I'm going to try to explain tonight, though, why realism is not just a reaction to postmodernity and relativism, but that it's interesting and even weird, that it's actually the weirdest thing going if you look at it the right way. It's a kind of realism without adequation. Not that there's a real outside of us that can be known, as in naive realism, but that the real is precisely that which cannot be known, but which is already articulated. So that's what I'm going to try to develop tonight. Of course, phenomenology, including both Husserl and Heidegger, treat realism as a pseudo-problem. They say that this idea whether the world exists outside of our mind is simply not worth the time of a serious philosopher. So that's one side of continental philosophy that dismisses the problem. The other side, of course, is from the return to Hegel, where Zizek is a good example of this, another one of my favorite philosophers, who sees, of course, the difference between real and ideal is somehow posited within the subject itself. You can't really talk about a naive thing in itself outside of the subject for Zizek. As part of this Hegelian turn, a number of scholars are cited regularly. Adrian Johnston, one of the best commentators we have on Zizek, cites Beiser's book on German idealism, The Struggle Against Subjectivity. And Beiser tells us that recent scholarship proves that German idealism was not subjectivist. Well, it's not that simple. It's not that you just go and do the scholarship and an objective result falls out that shows us that the German idealists were not subjectivists. You have to interpret, of course, as well, and that's a philosophical enterprise. What Beiser says is simply that the German idealists eliminate subjectivism by getting rid of any outside at all, by getting rid of Kant's naive thing in itself. In other words, by idealism. So you get rid of subjectivism by idealism, which is paradoxical and it doesn't work. The difference between thought and real becomes a distinction internal to thought, which makes it very strange when all these people accuse phenomenology of being idealist. You hear nothing but contempt for Husserl from these circles, but they're every bit as idealist as Husserl is, as phenomenology is. Now let's talk about Meillassoux for a second. Meillassoux, one of the promising younger philosophers in Europe right now. Meillassoux, in the interview I did with him in the appendix to my book on Meillassoux, accuses Zizek and perhaps Badiou of falling into this concept of the wobbly subject, that there's the traditional Cartesian subject, and there's something outside of it that it can't incorporate. There's this traumatic kernel of the real that disrupts the symbolic universe, in Zizek's case. And perhaps Badiou, he doesn't elaborate on how perhaps Badiou is guilty of this. That's his teacher. And but Meillassoux says a wobbly subject is still a subject, just like a wobbly chair is still a chair. Now, it's interesting. Zizek addresses this point in the new Hegel book, where he's got 20 or so pages on Meillassoux. Interestingly, Zizek concedes the point. He concedes the point that maybe Meillassoux is right. Zizek even goes so far as to say that, Meillassoux talks about the archifossil. He talks about things that really exist prior to the existence of the human subject. And even Badiou in Logics of Worlds says, of course, dinosaurs existed before humans existed. That's not problematic for Badiou, he claims. But Zizek goes so far as to say in that response that actually dinosaurs are a retroactively projected fantasy. Dinosaurs did exist in the past for us now. Dinosaurs cannot be thought of as existing really outside of us in the past. Dinosaurs are something posited by the subject now as a fantasy, a retroactive fantasy. And it's interesting to note that Bruno Latour got in trouble for a far more modest claim than that. Maybe people just haven't finished Zizek's big book yet and haven't scolded him for this yet. What Bruno Latour said in an article some years ago that earned him the permanent contempt of Alan Sokol and his friends is Latour said, we can't say Ramses II, the pharaoh, died of tuberculosis because tuberculosis hadn't been discovered yet. So it's an anachronism to say that he could have died of tuberculosis. That seems like going a bit far to me, but Zizek's saying something even more extreme, which is that we cannot say that dinosaurs really existed in and of themselves prior to the emergence of the subject. And Zizek ends by saying, actually, Meillassoux right, we can't escape the correlational circle. The correlational circle is the circle where you say, we can't talk about a thing outside of thoughts because by talking about it, we're thinking about it. And there's no way out of this circle. This is the path to idealism. It's also the path to what Meillassoux thinks is his own philosophy. Zizek says at the end, we can't escape it. Meillassoux admits at the first stage that we cannot escape it. We cannot just say there's a world out there naively. We have to go through this complicated serpentine argument in Meillassoux' philosophy to get to a thing in itself. But Zizek at the end of this chapter on Meillassoux says, no, we can never get out of it. And he seems to have this idea that Meillassoux is this dangerous, naive realist who thinks we can get outside the subject, and that's bad. That's why he's aiming this critique at Meillassoux. I claim that Meillassoux never escapes the circle either. I think he and Zizek are a lot closer together in their idealism than either Zizek or Meillassoux want to see. What does Meillassoux try to prove? Meillassoux tries to prove that even though there's this correlational circle, we can't talk about a thing in itself because then we're already talking about it, so it's already part of thoughts. We have to go through this indirect route, and through this indirect route, we find out that there are things in themselves, outside thought, according to Meillassoux. But what does he mean by this? All he really means is that the things in themselves outlive us. That's not what the thing in itself meant for Kant. The thing in itself for Kant meant the appearance is right here before us, but we can't get to the reality, the noumenon behind the thing here and now. For Meillassoux, that's not what it means. For Meillassoux, it just means that the thing in itself could have existed 1 billion years ago, and it could exist 1 billion years after all humans are extinct. But that's not really getting at the heart of what makes the thing in itself the thing in itself. Because, of course, Meillassoux thinks the real is whatever can be mathematized, very much in keeping with Bud, you as teacher. The primary qualities of things, no one really likes the distinction between primary and secondary qualities anymore. This comes from either Locke or Descartes, depending on who you credit with doing it first. The primary qualities are the qualities a thing has even when no one is looking at them. The secondary qualities are the ones that require us to look at them. So the food in your refrigerator, the taste and the smell of the food is a secondary quality, but it needs you there in order for it to exist. The primary quality will be the matter of which the food is made. That's still there, unless you're Berkeley, even when you're not looking at inside the refrigerator. Meillassoux wants to retrieve this concept of the primary and the secondary qualities, but he says the primary qualities are the ones that can be mathematized. By mathematizing the things, you can get at what is real in them. Now, you might ask, and I have asked this, why doesn't this turn him into a Pythagorean, someone who believes that only mathematics exists, that there's nothing outside of mathematical equations, formulae, formalizations? Meillassoux' way of trying to escape this is saying he's a materialist. Why is he a materialist? Because he also believes in dead matter. There's dead matter outside of the mathematics, dead matter outside of us. And he claims there's been this great conspiracy against materialism since Berkeley, that everyone in the modern era has been trying to absolutize the subject. This is what he calls subjectivism. And there are two kinds of subjectivism. One kind of subjectivism is the idealist kind. So Berkeley, in the extreme sense, you've got Hegel, you've got Schelling, you've got other idealist-sounding philosophers, Zizek, people who claim that we cannot really get anything outside the subject because the subject is absolutized. It's not limited, it encompasses the whole of reality. But there's also what he calls vitalists, and that includes me. These people he thinks also absolutize the subject because we put the subject everywhere. Because for me, of course, I agree with Kant's point about finitude. I agree that the in itself is unreachable. I simply think Kant should not have restricted this to people. The German idealist move is to say Kant shouldn't have had finitude, that to think of the in itself as already a thought, and therefore we don't have to think of an other that's outside the circle of thought. That's the German idealist move. I think there should have been a German realist turn in philosophy in the early 1800s that was missed, and it could have happened because of Leibniz's influence. It didn't. And that would have been to say that, Kant's right about finitude. We can never get at the things themselves, but objects cannot get the things at each other as things in themselves either. So when fire burns cotton, the famous example of Islamic philosophy, fire is not making contact with the color or smell of the cotton, which are in some sense there. They're only making contact with the flammability of the cotton. And so object relations are just as haunted by finitude as human object relations. I think this was a path that was never taken, could have been taken. Think of it as a kind of combination of Heidegger and Whitehead. You've got Heidegger's withdrawn, ungraspable being, and you've got Whitehead's cosmic world in which all relations are on the same footing. The human world relation is just a special case of the collision of two rocks or a sand grain dropping on the table. It's not some poignant, tragic human fate that we are finite. It's the fate of all objects. Relations never exhaust objects. You cannot define objects in terms of their relations or their effects. Now, so Meillassoux is saying that everything can be mathematized. Meillassoux even says, without irony, that he believes he can deduce absolute and eternal truths. He puts absolute and eternal in quotation marks, but always subtract quotation marks when people put them around key terms. They mean them, they just are trying to distance themselves from the full consequences. Meillassoux thinks he is deducing absolute eternal truths by mathematical means. So you have mathematism. You also have scientism more and more in the continental tradition, and Ray Brassier was probably the first to try this. And the main difference, of course, between mathematism and scientism is that if you're a scientistic philosopher, you can't really claim to have direct access to the absolutes in the straightforward sense that mathematistic philosophers can. For Meillassoux, it's one thing for Meillassoux to say he has absolute access to the primary qualities of things with mathematical formalization. All right, I don't agree with him, but he can claim this. If you're Ray Brassier, you can't really say this because scientific theories change over time. Right? Theories are always giving way to other theories, and so it's hard to claim that you ever have the final theory of anything. The way people try to deal with this is by getting into what they call structural realism, which is to say, yeah, the theories change, but there's a mathematical core that stays the same over time. So some of Newton's mathematical insights are preserved in Einstein and so forth. So mathematics is used as the eternal and absolute supports of science, which is always failing, always being falsified, always evolving. So one consequence of this scientific view of continental philosophy is it turns into a taxonomy, a division of labor. It says natural sciences deal with reality, and there's also illusions, and literature and arts and history deal with that. Right? It's a division of labor, very bad division of labor. As though science never deals with illusions and as though these other fields never deal with realities. It shouldn't be a taxonomy. It should simply be that all of reality has these two faces. There's the reality it withdraws from us, there's the reality insofar as it becomes present to us, but you can't say that's more or less true in the natural sciences than it is in the arts, literature, or any of these other fields. Now, Brassier distinguishes, following Wilfrid Sellars, between the scientific image and the manifest image. The scientific image is what the scientists tell us about ourselves, which is that we're just a bunch of neurons or even smaller things, and that all the things we learn from introspection about ourselves, like our personalities and our moods and emotions and all these things, these can be eliminated in favor of the, according to some people, eliminated in favor of the scientific discourse that explains us, that reduces that human level of us to the underlying scientific level. Brassier actually goes along with Sellars in saying we shouldn't, tends to agree that we shouldn't reduce either level to the other. But the scientific image is always privileged for these people. Now, there's a problem with this. There's a couple of problems with this. One of the problems is that the scientific image and the manifest image are both images. And so you have a philosophy that looks like the most hard-nosed scientific philosophy there is. And yet what it does is it says all that exists in the world are images. There's two kinds. There's the scientific kind, which are good. There's the manifest kind, which are bad. And what we need to do is find criteria so we can eliminate the manifest image and find the underlying scientific image, which usually turns out to be very boring. Like when you find this in Churchland, that, for example, that the manifest image is to say somebody's depressed, and the scientific image is to say they have a chemical imbalance in their brain. But I don't know why you need a whole scientific metaphysics to account for that. We can already do that. Psychiatrists already do that. There's that duality. Zizek has some sympathy, of course, for people like Metzinger and these other neurophilosophers, but for him it's only as part of a parallax, right? Because for Zizek there's this irreducible parallax between ourselves as we know ourselves through introspection and the fact that there's nobody home and the gray matter behind the skull. It's not that he privileges either of those, it's that he finds an undecidability between those two. Anyway, the problem, of course, with Brassier is that philosophy becomes the handmaid of the natural sciences, just like philosophy was the handmaid of theology in the Middle Ages. In fact, there's a sense in which the sciences, and sometimes politics, I would say, are replacing theology at the center of all these humanistic disciplines. They have to be the ultimate results of all of our work, otherwise they're worthless, just like theology was in the high points of all these disciplines in the Middle Ages. And what we find, however, is that a lot of the most innovative scientists don't want this. They don't want us to be their handmaids. They don't want philosophers to serve them. And I know of at least two great recent examples. One of them is Carlo Rovelli, who said in an interview with Collapse, which is a very scientifically minded publication in continental philosophy, that philosophers should stop trying to limp along after the scientists and explain what the scientists have already done. Why not jump out ahead and take risks? And then at Documenta last summer, I met Anton Seilinger, the Austrian physicist, and he said the problem he has talking with philosophers is they're too timid. They don't want to say anything about the real world because they're worried that the sciences have already cornered the market on inanimate matter, and philosophers don't think they have anything to add about this. But if you think about the role of Leibniz and Mach for Einstein's physics, there was a time when physicists really took these sorts of speculations seriously, when they were inspired by them, and this can happen again. And so it's important that we stop ghettoizing philosophy either in the human realm or in the realm of the relation between human and world, and start being able to talk about any interaction between any two objects at all, even if they're chemicals, not in order to replace science, but in order to speculate alongside science and perhaps serve as inspiration, if we're lucky. So anyway, the scientific image is still an image, which means that it's still a form of idealism. If all you have are the scientific images and the manifest images, you can be as rigorous sounding as you want about reducing all the manifest world to the scientific images, but you're still awash in a world of images. There's nothing deeper than the images. And Brassier complains, for example, that phenomenology he says phenomenologists claim that science wants to reduce all experience to this microphysical level, but actually phenomenology is reductionist. Phenomenology tries to reduce science to everyday experience and say that it's grounded in it. May be true of phenomenology, but it misses the point. The point is not that we're trying to reduce science to everyday experience. The point is that both science and everyday experience are abstractions of something deeper. This point comes up in Heidegger, for example. Heidegger has this famous tool analysis, the hammer, in Being and Time, which I think is the most important moment in 20th century philosophy, widely recognized by many people as such, but often misinterpreted. This idea, of course, is that against phenomenology, which talks about appearances, everything should be described in exact detail as to how it appears to consciousness. Heidegger simply points out that most things do not appear in consciousness. Most of the things we deal with are unconscious. The floor in this room that you didn't think of until I mentioned it, the air, the oxygen in the air, which actually in philosophy I do think of it because it's very hard to breathe here walking up from the island. But under normal circumstances, you don't think of the oxygen, you don't think of your bodily organs as long as they're functioning well. If you're listening to a language you know well, you don't think of the grammar consciously. All that stuff is in the backgrounds. Okay, very interesting point he makes that the phenomena are derivative of this deeper layer of unconscious reality. The problem is this is read too often in pragmatist terms. People read this as meaning that Heidegger shows that all theory is grounded in praxis, that before we theorize anything or look at anything, there's this background of practices. They're sometimes called social practices. So Hubert Dreyfus is the most popular commentator on Heidegger in terms of number of citations. Reads it in sociological terms. He says what this means is that Japanese babies and American babies are raised differently and so they perceive the world differently. Okay, there's a problem with this, which is that practical use of things doesn't exhaust them any more than staring at them does, or any more than theory does. So if you have a theory about this chair, whatever that would be, or if you look at the chair, you're abstracting from the reality of the chair because the chair is withdrawn from all those perceptions. The chair is deeper than any possible perception we have of it. If you're abstracting from that, when you do that, you're also abstracting when you sit in the chair. By sitting in the chair, I'm not exhausting all of its features either. A dog could smell things in the chair that I cannot smell. A mosquito can detect perhaps electromagnetic vibrations coming off the chair, whatever mosquitoes do. The mosquito has some access to the chair that I don't, and so forth. So you cannot say that either practical or theoretical dealings with things exhaust them. And this, I think, is the real insight of Heidegger that needs to be pushed even a step further. So first of all, what Heidegger is really showing us is not that praxis is deeper than theory, but that objects are deeper than both praxis and theory. Those are both forms of abstraction. And you have to push it one step further, which strikes some people as crazy, and say that this is true of all relations. It's not just that human praxis and human theory has this special tragic fate of oversimplifying things, of reducing things to translations or caricatures of their true being. This is the case with any interaction at all. I mentioned the fire and cotton example from Islamic philosophy. The fire is not interacting with the whole of the cotton and vice versa. There's always a limited interaction between things. And so this is why I said that Kant's, the problem with Kant is not that he had things in themselves, but that he did not push the things in themselves far enough. He did not push them into the inanimate realm, where if we do that, we'll find that causation can never occur directly. If fire cannot touch cotton completely, that means fire is not really touching cotton. Fire is touching an image of cotton. So you get what I call vicarious causation, or indirect causation. It's not just that people sometimes complain about representationalism in philosophy, that I can't see the microphone directly, I'm seeing a representation. I think that's actually true, but it goes further than that. It's that the microphone and the table can't encounter each other directly. The microphone and the table have to interact through a caricature of each other. And so any two real objects have to be mediated by what I call a sensual object. There are two kinds of objects. The real is mediated by the sensual is mediated by the real, which is even easier to see. I'm not seeing the full being of the microphone, I'm not seeing the full being of the glass. These are images. What mediates the two images? It's obviously me as a real entity that is encountering both simultaneously. Otherwise, they have no relation to each other. I'm the mediator for these, and this is the mediator between me and the real microphone. And you have to universalize this so it's not just about humans. So already we're getting a strange sort of realism, and this means that the real cannot be accessed directly. All of these mathematistic and scientistic versions of continental philosophy that are becoming so popular these days hinge on being able to have a privileged mathematical or scientific access to reality. And it's succeeding to some extent because continental philosophy has been so anti-science in sort of a weak way for so long that the return of the repressed, the mathematics and science are coming up and getting more status than they deserve, perhaps. Because I think indirect access to reality is perhaps even more powerful and more important. And I hold that you cannot paraphrase the real. You cannot paraphrase the real by trying to turn it into some set of properties that correspond to that real. More about that in a second. But I do think that unlike the sciences, which are under pressure to paraphrase things, and by paraphrase I mean electron is just a nickname for all the facts that we know about electron, right? An electron is not something over and above all those facts. That'd be a typical way of looking at scientific truth. Electron has the following 54 features, probably not even that many, 6. And that defines what an electron is. An electron is nothing more than a nickname for all the features it has. The sciences are under pressure to do that, because the sciences are under pressure not to posit hidden entities behind what can be measured of them. But if you think about the arts, the visual arts and literature, exactly the opposite pressure is at work. You're not going to literary critics have known for a long time that you cannot paraphrase a poem. You cannot state the meaning of a poem in prose terms that exactly replicate, exactly translate without information loss what the poem means. If you try to do this, you'll find that it's impossible. There's a certain excess, a certain surplus in the poem that is non-discursive, that cannot be brought into the realm of propositional discursive statements. In the case of artworks, you would not, unless you're doing it as a deliberate Dadaist exercise, you're not going to go into an art gallery and replace each of the works with a typed prose description that, there used to be a painting here by Picasso, and this is what he meant by it, this is what he was trying to do by it. This would be a very clumsy maneuver, unless you were doing it deliberately, and then it's a more complicated structure already that would have to be analyzed. That's why I wrote a notebook for Documenta last year called The Third Table. And what I was doing there's this famous set of lectures by Eddington, the physicist who verified Einstein's general relativity with his eclipse observations. This is what made Einstein world famous. And Eddington then went on to give the Gifford Lectures in Edinburgh, in which he talked about two tables. There are two tables here, he said, not one. There's the scientific table, which is mostly empty space, and it's just particles swarming around. It's not really a solid thing at all. And it's multiple, it's made up of all these parts. And then there's the practical table, which is the table that we use, the table that we put stuff on and use in practical terms. My claim in this essay was that neither of those is the real table. The real table is the third table, in between those two extremes. You cannot reduce the table to the physical particles of which it's made, because the table can endure even if the particles change. You also cannot reduce the table to the use that's made of it, because the use can change, and in some sense it's still the same table. So you have to get at the third table. You cannot get at the third table by direct means, because the only direct means for describing the table are to talk about what it's made of, or to talk about what it does. And neither of those gets at what the table is, because the table is more than what it's made of, and the table is less than what it does, because it can always do other things than the ones it's doing now. And I held in this little essay that the arts are more aware of this already. You're not going to do either of the extremes in the arts. You're not going to say, my sculpture is composed of 74% marble, 20% such and such, and 5%. You lose it as an artwork then, unless that's part of the artwork, which is again a more complicated. You might imagine an artwork that's structured that way, but in most cases, no. You're also not going to say this artwork is identical to my feelings about it, or to your feelings about it, or to the way it's currently positioned in this gallery right now. It's something more than that. It's something that's durable, that can be moved around to different shows, that can sustain different interpretations. I'd say the better the artwork is, the more interpretations it can sustain. In literature, I would guess that Hamlet can sustain a lot more interpretations than Batman, because he's a richer character, precisely because he's less reducible to the different things that could be said about him. And interestingly enough, there are two senses of critique that mean exactly the opposite thing. And this is what Hegel calls the speculative words, right, that have opposite senses in German. I think these do have, critique also, certainly in English has the two opposite senses, and I think in German also. Critique on the one hand can mean a reductive enterprise. By critique, you're either reducing a thing to its underpinnings and saying, you think there's a God, but actually it's just your class interests that are speaking through you, and it's superstition, and it's your irrationality. So that's a kind of critique of religion. You're reducing it to its underpinnings. You can also critique a thing by saying it's just a series of effects. The example I used this morning was somebody says there's a witch in the village, and you can say, no, there's no witch. There's just all these 5 or 6 coincidental things that make people think there's a witch. There's a baby that died suddenly, and blood on a doorstep, and poison in the well, and somebody heard laughter at night from over the rooftops, and then you combine all these things together and say, oh, it's a witch. Actually, there's not a witch. You're critiquing it by saying, no, that's just a series of effects that are not related. That's one kind of critique, where you're debunking something and saying it's not real. All that's there are the pieces, or all that's there are the effects. That's the usual sense of critique. But there's the other sense of critique that I think is much more interesting, which is wine criticism, art criticism, literary criticism, theater criticism, where you're doing exactly the opposite, where you're not reducing the work. You're trying to get at the work indirectly. Let me start with wine criticism. Daniel Dennett, one of the most reductionist philosophers alive in the analytic tradition, has this passage in one of his essays where he mocks wine tasting. And he gives the example of a flamboyant and velvety Pinot but lacking in stamina. A very funny example. All right, this could be completely pretentious. Some wannabe wine critic talking like this. There's always that risk. But what Dennett wants to do instead is pour the wine into the top of a machine that analyzes it chemically and spits out the chemical formula. The worst kind of reductive wine criticism. This isn't going to tell you anything about the wine. To do good wine criticism, you need the poetic sense. You need to be able to use the adjectives. And yes, it can lead to pretentious crap sometimes, but there is a difference between good and bad wine critics, just as between good and bad critics in any fields. And with experience, you gradually learn this. There's no foolproof method for knowing who the good ones are, who the bad ones are. But critique can also mean this kind of respect for the intermediate realm without breaking it down. That's the opposite sense of critique, the one that I prefer. All right. Now, moving on here, there's a guy named Lee Braver, who's a continental philosopher in the United States, and he's written a wonderful book, because it's so exactly wrong, called A Thing of This World, A History of Continental Anti-Realism. Actually, in one sense, it's right. It's right because he says continental philosophy up till now has been an anti-realist philosophy, and he celebrates this. That's the part that's wrong. He celebrates this and says it's great. The problem is, by the end of his book, you don't know where to go next, because by chapter 9 or whatever it is, Derrida has so thoroughly destroyed realism that you can't do it anymore. It seems like the end of history. Philosophy has come to an end with Derrida. There's nowhere to go. This linear progression towards less and less realism has ended. Okay, that's one thing about the book. Another interesting thing about the book is he says realism is an ambiguous term even in philosophy. And of course it has different meanings in art, in politics, in mathematics. Even in philosophy it's a mess to try to know exactly what's meant by it. So Braver makes a list of 6 things that realism means. And the most basic one is that there's a world outside of the mind, independent of us. All right, fine. But there's also one that I don't think necessarily belongs to realism, which is that this thing outside the mind can be known. That seems to me to be a bonus thesis that isn't necessary. And he misses the 7th. He misses the all-important 7th, which is that object-object relations must be on the same footing as human-object relations. Human-object relations cannot be at the center of philosophy like they were for Kant and onward, and even for Meillassoux. Again, there are 2 sides to Kant. I can't remember whether I mentioned this in this lecture already or earlier today, but I'll say it again. The 2 sides to Kant. One is that there are these things in themselves we cannot grasp because we're finite. That's one side of Kant. That's the side that German idealism reverses. That's the side that Meillassoux wants to reverse. His book is called After Finitude because he thinks that's horrible. We can get absolute knowledge. That's the side Meillassoux wants to reverse. I think you can't reverse that side. I think the finitude is always there. What you can reverse is the human world priority, so that in a Kantian framework, there's no way to talk about 2 billiard balls colliding in themselves. You have to say, what is it like for us when 2 billiard balls collide as a phenomenon for us? Cause and effect is a category of the understanding for Kant, and so you can't say that the 2 billiard balls really interact outside of us at all. I think that's the side that needs to be reversed, and that's why I said German realism, not German idealism. This kind of global theory of things withdrawing from each other and interacting only indirectly. All right. I would say actually the Whitehead reverses both of those in Latour too. That's why their philosophy is very different. They try to reverse the finitude, and they also try to reverse the human world priority. Okay. So I hold that objects are the starting point of philosophy, because I hold that the real is there. For Heideggerian reasons, I hold that the real withdraws behind any of its present-at-hand configurations, any of the way it appears to us, and not just the way it appears to us in theory or praxis, but the way objects appear to each other in their relations. That there's something deeper, there's a surplus in the things. Why do I talk about objects? Why don't I just talk about an undifferentiated lump that the human mind carves into objects? As Levinas sometimes says, as Jean Leclancy sometimes says, as even Metzinger says. Metzinger, this hard-nosed philosopher of neurophilosophy, says that in itself the world is a quasi-liquid holistic network, which, fine, that's a fine idea, but I can't imagine that someone like Metzinger, a hardcore scientific eliminativist, is saying something like this. The world is a quasi-liquid holistic network without objects in it. It's not your old-fashioned philosophy of science. The world as a whole, it only gets carved up later by our concepts. Bergson says things like this. You won't expect Metzinger to say it. Okay, so objects is the starting point of philosophy. Individual objects already articulated that withdraw from their relations. This in itself is not a completely new idea, because Austrian philosophy, from Brentano through Meinong and Twardowski up through Husserl, already took objects to be the central theme of philosophy. Why? Well, because philosophy is supposed to be universal. It's supposed to be able to talk about everything, and objects seem to them like the most universal thing you can talk about. You can talk about real objects, imaginary objects, square circles, centaurs and unicorns. Any of these things count as objects in a certain sense. And now we've got Tristan Garcia coming in French philosophy, the young French philosopher in his early 30s, who will publish his huge book in English early next year. It's already out in French, Forme et Objet. And he comes very much from this standpoint, post-Meinongian philosophy, that everything's an object and could be analyzed as a flat ontology on the same level. Okay, so why would anyone object to this? If it's so obvious that objects are the most universal theme, and talking about objects allows you to talk about material clumps, about armies, about mountains, about the EGS, about square circles and unicorns. It can allow you to talk about anything. Why would you object to that? There are really only 2 ways you can object to that. And both of these ways have occurred throughout the history of philosophy. There's what's called undermining and there's what's called overmining, and then there's their combination, which I call dual mining. So a very quick tour of the history of philosophy here, just a few minutes. What happens at the beginning of Western philosophy and Western science, among the pre-Socratics, is that they're not taking seriously intermediate everyday objects like horses and tables and trees and houses. These are all made of something more fundamental. This is how philosophy and physics is born in the West. What's the first answer? The first thing is that the first principle of everything is water, entheles. Water is what everything is composed of. Why? Because there's moisture in your breath. Living things need water. Water covers most of the earth, etc., etc. Water is the first principle of everything. Anaximenes, his disciple, said it has to be air. That air, simply by condensing air very tightly, you get all the hard things like bone and metal and blood. And by expanding air, you get fire. And so it rises because it's lighter than air. Then you have, of course, you can read Heraclitus as saying fire. Aristotle wonders why no one ever used earth as the first principle. That was never tried. Then you get finally Empedocles, who's really the founder of the so-called traditional four Greek elements, air, earth, fire, and water, mixed by love and hate. His motivation for having four is that you can't say, for example, that water is the principle of everything, because then fire would have to be made of water. And they're the opposites. If fire were made of water, it would quench itself. So there need to be these four equiprimordial elements joined by love, separated by hate. And then finally you have the atomists. The atomists who say that everything's actually even less specific than that. It's a bunch of particles, tiny particles moving through the voids. And of course this is still very respectable today in scientific materialism. The theory of atoms has been acceptable again since the early 20th century, even late 19th century, after a long period of oblivion. So that's one kind of pre-Socratic philosophy. They're saying that individual objects of the medium size are not real. You have to get down to this tiny layer of tiny particles, whether it's air, earth, fire, water, all of them combined, or atoms. But there's another kind of pre-Socratic philosopher that says even all of those things are too specific, because whatever is primordial must allow everything to emerge from it, everything we see. And this is what they call the apeiron. I don't have a marker, I don't think, but most of you probably know how to spell this. The apeiron is the boundless and limitless. Think of it as a kind of infinite lump that everything emerges from and passes back into. And the debate here is, what is the status of this apeiron in time? Did it exist in the past? Does it exist now? Will it exist in the future? So you've got some philosophers who think that there was an apeiron. There was this individual, infinite, unarticulated lump at the beginning of time, and it broke into pieces somehow to give us all the objects we see. And for Pythagoras, this happened when it inhaled void. It sucked in, and this created bubbles, and it split the world up into individual things. In the case of Anaxagoras, it was because a very powerful mind started thinking, it started rotating the apeiron very rapidly, it started vibrating, it started breaking into pieces, and that's why we have individual objects. Then you've got Parmenides, who thinks it's here now. He calls it being. Being is, non-being is not. So why do we see all these individual things? Our senses are deceiving us. If you use reason, if you use the logos, you'll see everything's one. And Zeno's paradoxes are in many ways designed to support this theory. This motion cannot happen because of the following paradoxes. Change cannot happen. And then you've got Anaximander, the first of the apeiron theorists, who says it will exist in the future. The existence of opposites, such as hot and cold, justice and injustice, rich and poor, these will be eliminated over time, gradually, and you'll end up with this indeterminate whole that doesn't have any properties in particular. And this was probably an influence on Marx and the end of the class structure over time, since Marx did write his PhD thesis on these early Greek philosophers and knew them very well. So that is also around today. Scientific materialism follows this one kind of pre-Socratic that breaks things down to particles, and that's very respectable today. But on the other end, we have these philosophies of the pre-individual, like Simondon or the early Levinas, people who think that there was this inarticulate thing that somehow got broken up, or it's a pre-individual thing anyway. It might not be fully homogeneous lump, but it's a pre-individual thing. It's before individuals are articulated. So you see both of these today. These are both undermining kinds of philosophy. As far as the other kinds, overmining. Undermining theories, you tend to see them in the sciences. Overmining theories, you tend to see them in the humanities. These are the ideas. If undermining says objects are too shallow, objects are so shallow, how could you believe in horses and trees? Obviously, there's smaller things that they're made of. Objects are too shallow. The overmining theories say objects are too deep. Why do you need a theory of objects? There's just events, or there's just language, or there's just appearances, or there's just networks of power relations, or there's any mathematizations. That's all that really exists. There's this surface that's not hidden from us. It's accessible to us. These are the overmining theories, the theory that you don't need to go deeper than appearances. That there's something is already immanent to us. All the philosophies of immanence that are so popular now are overmining theories. Bergson's matter and memory, in which everything that exists is an image. That's a kind of overmining theory. And so that's the exact opposite in some ways. Bruno Latour's idea, my favorite living philosopher, but still I disagree with him completely on this point. This idea, a thing is nothing more than its actions. There is no thing hidden behind its actions. A thing is nothing more than whatever it transforms, modifies, perturbs, or creates. There's a problem with both of these. The problem with the undermining theory I hold is that it cannot explain emergence. Since it's reducing everything to the tiniest stuff of which it's built, it cannot explain the fact that things are robust to some extent to changes in their pieces. The atoms are leaving your body constantly and being replaced by new atoms from the food you're eating. It doesn't mean you're a different person, does it? Just because you lose a few atoms here and there. It would make no sense to call you a different person. It would make no sense to call the EGS a different institution every time somebody leaves or arrives. Leibniz didn't think the Dutch East India Company was a real entity because it's an aggregate made of different parts. Why isn't the Dutch East India Company every bit as real as an atom? It didn't last as long, but it had a certain durability. Some of its ships could sink and it could replace them. It's still the Dutch East India Company within certain limits. There can come a point at which a thing changes too much, but within certain limits, a thing can withstand certain changes in its internal pieces, but a thing can also withstand changes in the effects it has in its environment. If I move myself 1 meter back from the rest of you, you're not going to say I'm a different person. That does follow, though, from theories like Latour's and Whitehead's, because everything is a giant relational network, and as soon as you change your place in the network, you've changed completely. The problem with overmining philosophies is that they cannot explain change, I hold. Aristotle already saw this. If I am nothing more than my effect on all of you right now, and the effect on my family members who are thinking of me, my effect on the atmospheric oxygen now, and my banking things going on, if I'm nothing more than my effect on those other things, how can I be different 5 minutes from now, or a year from now, or 10 years from now? There must be something in me that's a surplus, that is not fully inscribed in my current actuality, that is not fully expressed, that might never be expressed. Maybe I'm really, really good at something and I don't. Maybe I'm the best marksman. I've never fired a gun in my life. Maybe I'm the best marksman and I've never tried it and will never try it. And so I'll never activate this side of me. But it could be there as a surplus that is not expressed now or in any past period of my life. So that's the problem with both of these, undermining and overmining. And these are basically the only two strategies for getting rid of objects. You either say objects are too shallow or they're too deep. Those are the only two things you can say to critique it. The funny thing is that these two usually enter into conspiracy with each other. They support each other, they're parasitical off of each other because they need each other. So to give some examples, scientific materialism looks like an undermining theory because it says all this stuff isn't real, you have to go down to the tiniest level of small particles or mathematical structure. So it seems like the thing is so deep and inaccessible, deeper than anything we can see. It's an undermining gesture. But then it reverses because it says those things aren't unknowable, they're totally mathematizable. Science can tell us what the equations are for these things, and so it comes back up to the surface where it's knowable. It comes back to the human level where we can understand, where we can master it and know it. And so what's getting destroyed in that case is the intermediate level of real things. All you have is the bottom level structure and the upper level structure where humans are talking about things in mathematical terms. That's one example. Ladyman and Ross, I've written a critical article on James Ladyman and Don Ross, who on the one hand are uncompromising scientific philosophers. They say that all that exists is mathematical structure at the bottom of everything. All the objects you see don't really exist in the usual sense. That's an undermining philosophy. But then they have to account for why things exist that aren't physics, like geology. They respect all the sciences. So how does geology exist if it's not talking about particles? How does biology exist if it's not talking about particles? And any other science. They even say there can be a science of traffic jams, if somebody did it the right way. Okay, how can a science of traffic jams exist if traffic jams aren't just particles? They come up with this weird theory that says, well, traffic jams do exist, and mountains do exist, and frogs do exist, but only for the scientist. They emerge simultaneously with the scientist, and in that sense, these objects exist at a level for us, but they're still independent of us, they claim, because they're outside of us, they're not inside of our minds. They never explain how that's the case. Those are two kinds of what I call dual mining. Another case will be Latour, because Latour, as I said, is the wonderful philosopher of relational networks where a thing is nothing more than its effects. When you move a thing to a different point in a network, you have to explain why it's the same thing as the thing 5 minutes ago at a different place in the network. You can't assume that I now and I 10 years ago am the same person in actor network theory. You have to show that there's an equivalence. So that's a very much an overmining philosophy, that a thing is totally determined by its effects on the environment. But then Latour starts to realize in the last 10 years or so that you can't really explain change this way. And I mentioned it was Aristotle who discovered this. Aristotle was arguing against the Megarians, who were among his rivals at the time. The Megarians said no one is a house builder unless they're building a house right now. If you're not building a house right now, you're not a house builder. You only are what you actually are. There's an obvious problem with this, which is, let's say a master house builder is asleep and someone else is awake who doesn't know anything about building houses. You're not going to say that they're on the same level, right? You're going to say that the sleeping master house builder is a potential house builder in a much stronger sense than this person who doesn't know anything about it, who happens to be awake and standing near the house. So Aristotle saw there had to be something called potentiality that is withdrawn from the current state of things. I wouldn't call it potentiality, but that's a side issue. Latour starts to realize that you need this too, that you need a reservoir in the things. He even calls it virtuality sometimes. It's in the things that's not fully actualized here and now, but then it gets a little weird. He calls this the plasma. And he blames the plasma for all changes that happen, pretty much. He says, why did the Soviet Union collapse overnight with no one expecting it? The plasma. The plasma was this unthematized reservoir of potentiality or of virtuality beneath the Soviet Union that we saw. Even if the Soviet Union had been working perfectly, this plasma could have ruptured it. Suddenly, okay? Why do love affairs and friendships break up suddenly when no one expects it? The plasma. And my favorites, why does the most mediocre academic musician suddenly write a brilliant symphony? I don't know if it happened ever, but the plasma. And he says that all the networks between things are the size of the London Undergrounds, the plasma is the size of London as a whole. But it's just the operon again. It's this giant indeterminate lump. There are two problems with it. One of them is that all situations would seem to be equally fragile and non-fragile. If the plasma can randomly rupture things, then the most stable relationship could be destroyed by the plasma just as much as the most fragile relationship, which is counterintuitive. The other thing is that the plasma is inarticulate. It's the same plasma that's destroying the Soviet Union and causing the composition of a brilliant symphony, which also seems counterintuitive. The same underground inarticulate reservoir that wells up and changes things. Garcia, this up-and-coming young French philosopher whose book is coming out next year, we're very close in many ways intellectually, but he says that I talk about the third table that's neither its pieces nor its environmental effects. Garcia says the table is the difference between those two. It's the difference between its pieces and its effects. The problem with that is that means it's oversensitive in both directions. That means the table changes if its atoms change or if its position changes. So there really isn't a table. There's just a thing that's hypersensitive to both its internal and its external components. These are all kinds of dual mining, and Heidegger talks about presence at hand, Derrida talks about presence, Meillassoux about correlationism as the great enemies in the history of philosophy. I think the greatest enemy in the history of philosophy is dual mining, this idea that you lose the things by reducing them in both directions simultaneously. The thing is nothing but its particles and it's nothing but its effects. You lose the thing itself. And philosophy was meant as an attack on this, as my argument. Philosophia means love of wisdom. It means you're never getting at the thing. You're getting closer to the thing, you love the thing, you're getting at wisdom. Socrates never defines what virtue is. He asks for the definition, but he never gets one. You're approaching it somehow. But you cannot explain a thing either by decomposing it into its elements or by talking about how it affects other people. Philosophy is trying to get at that third table. It's trying to get at philosophy, and I would say the arts. This is their hidden union. Both are trying to get at the third table that cannot be paraphrased. They're both activities that deny the possibility of paraphrase if they're done well. So this requires an indirect approach to objects. And the usual complaint is, oh, this is just negative theology. You're just saying, we can't know anything about the table. So it's like negative theologies of God, where you're saying God is not physical, God is not evil, God is not. It's not really a negative theology. It's an indirect theology, and it's not even a theology. But if it were, it would be an indirect theology. That you're talking about things indirectly, whether through metaphor, through rhetoric, through strategic silences. This has been known a long time. This is not some crazy new idea. This has been known. For example, in the study of rhetoric in ancient times, Aristotle tells us what rhetoric is. Rhetoric is about saying something without saying it. You're not saying it directly, you're hinting. You're saying, his famous example is, this man has already been crowned 3 times with a laurel wreath. In Greece, you didn't have to say, because he won the Olympics 3 times, and we always give this prize for the winners of the Olympics, because all Greeks knew this. It would have been treating them as stupid to state it at that time. Marshall McLuhan treats media as rhetorical in this sense, that the fact that there's a good or bad television show is unimportant compared with the fact that it's television and not radio. It's altering your ratios of sense perception, it's influencing you in a background way. So in a sense, television is more important than the content of any given television show, just the way that it's influencing you from the background. So there's that rhetorical aspect. I've often referred to the example of the Godfather, making you an offer you can't refuse, which is far scarier than spelling out the threats, right? Saying, if you don't give my friend the part in the movie, I'm going to cut off your horse's head and throw it in your bed, which is grotesque and grisly, but it's somehow not as frightening, because you can counter that threat in various ways if it's too specific. It's better to leave it vague. Metaphor also, this has been known by a number of critics, cannot be paraphrased in discursive terms. You cannot say, here's what this metaphor means. Any attempt to paraphrase it is doomed to fail, because there's always a surplus in the metaphor, a surplus in any artwork that is going to elude that sort of prosaic description. And so this is another way in which all of these examples of indirect communication, indirect access, are better examples for philosophy than mathematism or scientism, which claim to be able to replace a thing either with a matheme, mathematizable formula, or with scientific discovery. Okay, now, very quickly, we're doing okay, right? Got another 5 minutes? Just to wrap up then, there have been three schools of philosophy, perhaps, that have avoided this dual mining by focusing on the reality of individual things. The first, of course, being Aristotle's, where he's the first to say that the primary substance is an individual thing. And that was risky because Aristotle was the first to say that the primary substance is destructible. For all these earlier philosophers, the pre-Socratics, who think that water is the primary thing, water cannot be destroyed, atoms cannot be destroyed, Plato's perfect forms cannot be destroyed. Aristotle was the first to say that the ultimate constituents of reality can be destroyed. You've got horses, they can be killed and the bodies can rot. So individual things are the primary reality for Aristotle and for his followers, such as Leibniz and the scholastics. The problem being that Aristotle tends to privilege natural things over unnatural things. That Aristotle, and especially Leibniz, Leibniz says a person is a thing, but a circle of people holding hands is not a thing. The Dutch East India Company is not a thing. A weird example, a diamond is a thing, but a pair of diamonds glued together is not a real thing. Which is strange because even one diamond takes a lot of work. It's very artificial to polish it and cut it the right way. So that's the problem with that school, in my opinion, is that Aristotle cannot account for compound objects or artificial objects, technological things, social objects, such as armies, countries, societies, all of these things, friendships. Then you've got Latour and Whitehead. Latour and Whitehead are a bit broader. They're able to account for any kind of entity, including artificial ones, including very large ones, including imaginary ones, but they tend to over-relationize things. They boil things down to the relational effects they have on other things, don't see this surplus that's there. Then finally there's phenomenology, and I'll talk very quickly about the two kinds of objects. I mentioned Heidegger already, that he's trying to say there's something deeper than phenomena can access. There's a deeper reality, a deep object that's withdrawn from the surface of appearances. But there's also Husserl, who, even though he does look like an idealist, who does look like there's nothing beyond the appearances, does make a decisive breakthrough in the history of philosophy against empiricism. Empiricism tells us that there are no objects in experience. There's just qualities. There's attributes that get bundled together by habits. So there's not an apple in your hand. There's red, cold, sweet, hard, juicy, spherical. And because I see those things come together so often, I say, oh, I'm going to invent a nickname called apple, which is shorthand for all these attributes. But really, it's just habit that makes me think that there's this thing called an apple that's there and the same all the time. Phenomenology totally overturns this. It reverses it. It says the thing comes first and the attributes come second. Revolutionary step. Why? Because Husserl notices that you don't turn the apple in your hand and say, here's a series of closely connected appearances that resemble the one of a millisecond ago. Therefore, it's probably the same thing of a series of appearances that link them all together. No, you don't say that. You say, this is the same apple, and I'm seeing different parts of it at a given time. And the whole point of phenomenology is to analyze each appearance and figure out which of those qualities can be dispensed with and which of those qualities are essential, which of the qualities are essential to the thing. So you have these sensual objects in Husserl that have sensual qualities, but they also have real qualities because they have qualities that they need in order to be what they are. The apple doesn't need to be seen from precisely this angle, but there are certain features it needs in order to be an apple. You can't explode it into a million pieces and still have it be an apple, for example. It has to have a certain physical integrity, to give one example. So you've got Heidegger's real objects, which are hidden. You've got Husserl's, he calls them intentional objects. I call them sensual objects. It's a better name, which do not exist outside of our access to them, because I can analyze, in phenomenology, I can analyze a unicorn that appears in my hallucinations. I can analyze myths and delusions and these sorts of things. So you have two kinds of objects and also two kinds of qualities, because the real object also has its real qualities. I won't draw this on the board. You can read my book, The Quadruple Object, if you want to see these diagrams. But there ends up being a tension between the two kinds of objects, the two kinds of qualities, and I argue in the book that this is where time, space, essence, and eidos are generated from. They're generated from, these are not pre-existent continua, they are generated by the tensions between objects and their qualities. And so, whereas most kinds of philosophy try to collapse differences, tries to collapse a real thing into just a series of appearances, or it tries to collapse an apple into its attributes that we can see, object-oriented philosophy is about examining the tension between all objects and their qualities. It's about polarizing things. It's about playing with those and seeing what happens when a thing is in tension with its qualities, when it cannot be reduced to them. Now, I also should have said that one of the implications of Heidegger's theory, since things withdraw from each other, I did say this at the beginning, since things withdraw from each other, you wonder how they can make contact at all. Right? And the classical solution for philosophies that think objects can't make direct contact is what's called occasionalism. It's to say that God it enables the contact. This started in Islamic theology, where some of the rather extreme conservatives held that it's not just blasphemous to say that other things are creators besides God, it's also blasphemous to say anything is a causal agent other than God. So to say that I pick up this glass is blasphemy, because only God can be the causal source of everything. And so my seeming to touch this glass is simply the occasion for God to raise the glass. This was originally an Islamic position, brought into European philosophy because of Descartes, because of the distinction between the two substances, the physical and the mental. How could they possibly touch each other? They can't unless God is coordinating the two. There's not really a body-body problem for Descartes. It's a mind-body problem. The body-body is okay for Descartes because he thinks of it as one giant physical thing. There's not really gaps there. But Malebranche, his great disciple in France, also brings God back in for body-body interactions. All right, now you might laugh at this. You might say, okay, this is very quaint, but nobody in the Western world really believes that God is intervening and picking up water glasses and things like this. So what's the point? It's the kind of thing that undergraduate students make fun of when they learn about it. All right, fine. Actually, some of my students in Egypt do hold to some version of occasionalism. But in the Western world, it's true that nobody does, for the most part. But notice that we still believe in a version of this. We still think that the problem with occasionalism isn't that it's God, and we're all enlightened intellectuals who shouldn't believe in God. The problem with occasionalism is that it gives one entity a monopoly on causation, God. We do the same thing, though, with the human mind. Look at Hume and Kant. What is causation for Hume? It's a habit. It's a customary conjunction of things. We can't say there's cause and effect outside the mind. We see things happening habitually the same way over and over and over again, and so we assume that there's a causal link between them, even though there isn't. That's Hume's version. Kant's version is to say that cause and effect is a category of the understanding. We can't say that it exists outside the understanding. So in a way, these are upside-down occasionalists. Hume and Kant, who are still considered sober figures. I mean, you can go get a job in a philosophy department at a university saying, I believe Hume is right about everything, or I believe Kant is right about everything. You know, if you were to say, I believe Spinoza is literally right about everything, they might look at you funny, or Leibniz. But with Hume and Kant, we enter, to some extent, the contemporary period of philosophy, because you can still literally believe those two. They're saying the same thing as the occasionalists. They're just turning it upside down. They're saying that the human mind has a monopoly instead of God's. All right? Whitehead even resurrects the God parts. Whitehead even says that I'm seeing this guy's white shirt, but actually all the different colors of the rainbow are in his shirts. And if I were more intelligent like God, I would prehend all of those colors in him. Instead, I'm very limited in my comprehensions, and so I'm only seeing white there when there's actually a multitude of colors. So everything goes through God. All the relations go through God for Whitehead, which is very bold in the 1920s to say something like this. Latour, though, pushes it a step further. Latour, who's in many ways an heir of Whitehead intellectually, secularizes occasional causation. He secularizes it. I'll explain what I mean. Latour, despite being in many ways more religious on a personal level than Whitehead was, never appeals to God in his metaphysics like that. Latour is never just going in and pulling God in to solve problems, the way Whitehead does with relation. What Latour says is that any two things are mediated by a third thing locally. And his famous example from Pandora's Hope is saying, who links politics with neutrons? Who would have thought that politics and neutrons had anything in common? Nobody thought that. There weren't even neutrons were not discovered until 1929, and then for a few years nobody thought they had a political connection. And then finally, Frédéric Joliot, the French physicist, the son-in-law of the Curies, said politics and neutrons are connected. We need to start our atomic bomb project very fast before Hitler gets his. And so he was the first, at least in France, to establish a connection between politics and neutrons. And so Latour says that means it wasn't God or the human mind. It was one particular person, Joliot, who connects politics with neutrons by showing that there's a link. There's a big, big problem here, though, that I mentioned in my seminar, which is that if politics cannot touch neutrons, then why can Joliot touch politics and why can Joliot touch neutrons? You've just pushed the problem a step back further, and you can analyze that a bit. You can say Joliot touches neutrons with some kind of scientific instrument. How does he touch the instrument? With his eyeball. How does he touch his eyeball? With the nervous system. How does Joliot touch his own nervous system? And Latour cuts off this infinite regress through a pragmatic strategy. He says you stop when it's no longer interesting. So you can analyze it as far as it's interesting, and then you can give up whenever you want, because it's boring to ask how Joliot touches his nervous system. It's a purely medical question. The problem is that doesn't solve the problem. That allows you to cut it off and not bore people, but it doesn't solve the problem of how any two things can make contact. The reason this happens for Latour is because Latour has a flat ontology, meaning all actors are on the same level. They're all of the same kind. There's no difference between a human and a canoe and a unicorn and Popeye, and all these things are on the same level. And so therefore, any two actors you pick, you have to put a third term in, and then you have to put a third term in between those, and another between those, and another between those. and it becomes like Zeno's paradox, where you can't walk to the door because there's always an intermediate point between where you are and the door, no matter how close you get. So I say the only solution to this is to have two kinds of objects, and so that objects can only touch the opposite kind of object. It's like magnets. Magnets cannot make contact if you touch the same poles together, north and north, they'll repel. But if you link north to south and south to north and north to south and south to north, you could make an infinite chain of magnets by doing it that way, and I think that's how it works with objects, that real objects are mediated by sensual objects are mediated by real ones. That is the heart of object-oriented philosophy. Indirect discourse, such as the arts, metaphor, rhetoric, these should be our models, rather than the science we've worshipped slavishly and the deductive mathematics we've worshipped slavishly in philosophy for the last 400 years. Whitehead makes a very good case that deductive method is not the way for philosophy to go anyway. And in this sense, I think the analytic continental split does not need to be bridged, but needs to be intensified even more until something better replaces it. But for now, let's widen it. Let's widen the strife, widen the differences between them. That's really our only chance of getting beyond it. Thanks very much. I probably did go a little long. Thanks for listening.